The acting head of FEMA made its first visit to Kerrville, Texas today after the devastating floods that left at least 129 people dead and more than 150 who are still missing. This comes as Central Texas right now is facing new threats of flash flooding from storms this weekend, and also as search crews continue to look for all of those missing people. There's also new reporting from the New York Times that says documents show FEMA did not answer thousands of calls from flood survivors. The agency struggled to answer calls in a timely manner because it had fired hundreds of contractors at the call centers. That's according to this reporting. The Times also reporting FEMA faced similar challenges after Hurricanes Helene and Milton hit the South last year. Let's bring in CNN's Julia Vargas Jones, who joins us now from Kerrville, Texas. And Julia, a lot of questions about this FEMA response that happened after the flooding.
There are a lot of questions, Jessica, and this is part of what we posed to the acting administrator, I should say, of FEMA when he was here today, but did not get a response. But the details from this New York Times reporting are so interesting because they detail the ending of those contracts on the 5th, and you see the number of calls answered just dropping on the next day and dropping all the way to 15% on the 3rd day. That, of course, as CNN has reported on this new rule from FEMA where DHS Secretary Kristi Noem has to personally approve expenses that go above $100,000, and that this kind of red tape slowed down the response of those search and rescue teams that weren't deployed for more than 72 hours. Now, speaking earlier today, Secretary Noem did say that this will be the new normal for this administration in the response to disaster going forward. Take a listen.
Some of what you saw for our response in Texas is going to be a lot of how President Trump envisions what FEMA would look like into the future. We did things in Texas for response very different than Joe Biden. That's what President Trump wants. He wants the states to be empowered. Listen, emergencies, and we're in the middle of hurricane season too, so it's important for Florida to know this too. Emergencies are locally executed. They are state managed. The state then manages it. The federal government comes in and supports.
And Jessica, it's worth noting that Texas Governor Greg Abbott praised FEMA's response and said that this was swift and effective, as he praised both that and President Trump in his visit here on Friday.
And Julia, we're also learning FEMA removed dozens of Camp Mystic buildings from a 100-year flood map before the expansion there. What more have you found out about that?
Well, it's actually rather puzzling, Jessica, I have to say, because this goes back to 2011 when FEMA had basically designated this whole area where Camp Mystic was as a special flood hazard area. And I think we have the map that we can show there. Basically, this was an area that would be required to have flood insurance, and it would be subject to tighter regulations for any buildings that would be built in the future. 2011, 2 years later, they grant an appeal that allows for all of Camp Mystic to be exempted from these regulations, including 15 of the buildings. Now, if you look at that red zone there, and then there's the white surrounding part, there are parts of Camp Mystic that were in what is called a regulatory floodway and parts that were in the 1% annual chance of flood hazard. Now, we know that this is a camp that's 99 years old. 15 of those buildings, those individual buildings from the camp were in there. And then again, in 2019, they get another exemption for another 15 buildings as this camp is expanding. Now, those are a little bit closer to a lake area that was not as damaged, but it just goes to show that there was an awareness dating back to 2011 of the level of danger of this. And it is worth adding, Jessica, that local officials here in Kerr County had also submitted to FEMA a report back in October where they warned of the potential of a disaster of this magnitude happening this year.
All right, Julia Vargas Jones, thank you so much for that reporting. And we are joined now by Syracuse University Associate Professor Sarah Prowley. Thank you so much for being here with us. I know you spent a lot of time studying FEMA's flood map determinations. What do you know about this particular case that Julia was just laying out there at Camp Mystic?
Well, as Julia said, they applied And I would like to point out that it's the camp that applied for these appeals to FEMA. So FEMA granted them, but it was initiated by the camp itself in 2 separate years. And it's disturbing because at least in some years, it appears that the camp was spending time and resources challenging the maps. I personally think that time and money would have been spent much better in trying to adapt to the future flood risk, current flood risk, in fact, and in a more forward-looking way, in a proactive way that would be more protective.
And so walk us through these flood map designations. We're kind of looking at a version of that right now, but you say that this leaves really no margin for error. How should people be reading these maps?
Well, the maps have these lines on them. Those become the most important lines for regulatory purposes and insurance purposes because they designate the areas that FEMA considers to be at a 1% risk of flooding or higher on an annual basis. And those lines determine who has to buy insurance and who doesn't have to buy insurance. And they determine the regulations on building within the flood zone or outside of that. So within the flood zone, building is somewhat limited and there's more strict building codes. So typically construction is more expensive within those lines. And so what happens is, in this case, they tried to get some of those structures to be drawn outside of those lines. But the truth is lines don't, floods don't adhere to what lines on the maps, right? So if you're right outside the flood zone, you're often at as much risk as those that are inside the flood zone.
And I know you also published a study in 2021 where you did analyze 20,000 buildings that had been removed from FEMA flood maps. What did you find in that study?
Yes, so this was the research I did with Devin Lee, a colleague, and we looked at the appeal process. So what this is that after communities have redrawn their new flood maps, there's a period in which they can appeal those maps if they think that they're inaccurate. In addition, individuals or businesses can appeal as well to FEMA. And so what we found was we were curious about, in these appeals, do flood maps expand? Do structures get drawn into the flood zone because they recognize there's greater risk than they thought? Or do structures get taken out of the flood zone, typically through this appeals process? And we found that it's much, much more likely that buildings get taken out of flood zones during these appeals process. And that really flies in the face of evidence to show that the maps themselves already underestimate flood risk. So it's strange that across the country, these structures are being removed. And we think that it has to do with some other factors, not having to do with actual flood risk.
All right, Sarah Prowley, thank you so much. We really appreciate it.